Great. Thanks so much. So yes, welcome to our conversation for those watching the recording on LGBTI displacement in Palestine and the greater Levant area. We are sharing today from the Society of Gender Professionals. This is one of our gender cafes. So we are a society of people who work on gender. We foster production and dissemination of gender research, provide platforms for exchanging ideas, advance gender justice, promote development of gender expertise, and really do a lot of community building. Yeah, Lou, you can go to the next slide for a little bit more about SGP. We are a membership organization. If you would like to join, Aparna will stick a link in the chat, and we encourage you to join. You can run for elected positions. We have a professional development fund. We have networking and other member-only events. And so annual dues are very flexible. It's the value of a meal in your local context, and we do have a membership dues fund for those of you who do not have the extra money to spare on a membership. So you can always reach out to us there. And then next slide, please. Great. So SGP has, we call them circles. They're communities of practice. We have gender and climate. We have ending sexual harassment at the workplace. And we also have breaking gender and sex binaries, who is hosting this conversation. So in Breaking Binaries, we really foster a space for sharing experiences across cultures around gender and sex diversity, LGBTQI plus inclusion. So you can always join us, and we have a lot of these conversations because we love talking about gender. Next slide, please. Great. So we are being this event is being co-hosted today by the Lebanese American University's Institute of Migration Studies, which Jasmine is joining us from. So this is a policy-driven, network-oriented research institute that really serves as a resource center for grad students, for activists, for humanitarian staff, lots of people who are studying migration in Lebanon and the Middle East region. And then also, next slide, please. We are being joined by Global Development for Palestine, which is an all-volunteer action group. It's a lot of folks who are in humanitarian assistance and international development. And they do a lot of great stuff. There's some actions that they're doing. They do webinars, policy papers. So if you want to get involved, we'll also share some links in the chat. And you can get involved in many different ways: social media, volunteering, attending events, etc. And then next slide. All right, so today we are going to talk about mostly this panel on LGBTQ plus displacement. That's what we will record. And then we will not record the Q&A and discussion, just to provide an extra sense of security and safety for folks to share. But we will be taking notes again, and we will share the recording and a report later on. Then next slide about our goals. So we are here to learn, of course, more about the context and displacement that LGBTQ plus people are facing in Palestine and the greater Levant area. I will note our panelists work a lot with Palestinian refugees, but are not themselves from Palestine. So that is a notable area that we're lacking in terms of our representation. We are here to answer your questions, dispel myths, misconceptions about queer Arabs. We want to learn about your experiences and co-create knowledge as we can. So please do share experiences that you've had in these areas. And of course, we want to share some concrete actions that you all can take in solidarity with queer people in Palestine and the greater Levant area. And then I think with that, I will turn it over to Jasmine, who is joining us from LAU IMS, Institute of Migration Studies. She's going to be our moderator, and I'll come back a little later. So over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bren, and thank you to everyone joining us. Honestly, the number of people on this call is heartwarming. Thank you so much again, and thank you for the space and for trusting us with this. A little bit more to add to what Bren said about why we're here is so that we can bring insights from the region, from our research and advocacy work. We represent academic institutes, as Bren said, but also non-governmental organizations and lobbying groups as well, and we hope to draw on all of that experience as we discuss this with you today. Off the bat, of course, we will be focusing on the Levant and the entire region. We're going to employ a little bit of a comparative lens to our experiences and our findings across our research, and also touch, of course, on Palestine more specifically. At our institute, I will touch a little bit throughout the conversation on our work with Palestinian refugees from the queer community, as well, of course, the panelists in whatever capacity they've also engaged with Palestinians from the community as well. Recognizing, of course, that we do not have a Palestinian panelist, unfortunately, with us. So not to have a conversation on behalf of everyone, but to share a little bit more on our findings as well. I think what I'll do first before we delve into the Q&A is I'll ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. So I am joined first by Ribal Matou. Would you like to introduce yourself, Ribal, to the room?
Thank you very much, Jasmine. Hi, everyone. This is Ribal Matou. I'm based in Beirut, Lebanon. I'm currently in Nepal, in Kathmandu. I work at the interface between queer activism and the humanitarian and development sectors in Lebanon, in the Swana region, as well as globally. I wear different hats as a researcher, as a trainer, and as a person that works on direct project implementations that directly contribute to the LGBTIQ plus community. I also serve the role of the National LGBTIQ plus Task Force in Lebanon, a task force that engages different organizations and agencies working directly and indirectly on LGBTIQ plus related issues, mainstreaming SOGIESC, diverse SOGIESC needs, rights, challenges, and protection across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'll get back to you later.
Thank you so much, Ribal. Next, we're joined by Pinar Erdem. Please go ahead, Pinar.
Thanks, Yasmin. Hi, everyone. My name is Pinar Erdem, originally from Turkey, but I'm currently in Germany, based at the University of Bremen, where I pursue my PhD on LGBTQ forced migrant women in Turkey. I'm also affiliated with Mosaic MENA as a researcher. We recently published a report on violence against LGBTQ refugee women in Turkey and Lebanon. I have worked as a researcher and consultant for different organizations such as UNFPA Turkey Humanitarian Program and HRW. So today, although my work is around Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria, my input will be based on my work in Turkey, since we already have amazing colleagues from Lebanon here. So thanks for having us, Bren, and the whole team, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Pinar. Wonderful. And finally, we have Bshara Samne. Bshara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. How are you? I'm going to keep my camera off now just to resolve a technical issue, and then I'll be joining with the camera, hopefully. So my name is Bashara Samne. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm also based in Lebanon. I'm a board member of... Sorry. Oh. So I'm a board member at Mosaic MENA, which is a local LGBTIQ plus organization that also works on a regional level. In addition to that, I've also served in different capacities with different organizations, one of which was ILGA Asia, where I was leading on the Afghanistan Queer Support Resettlement Program. And in addition to that, I've worked as a consortium manager at ACTED, which is a French INGO, to lead on the first national comprehensive needs assessment for the LGBTIQ plus community in Lebanon. Nice to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So sorry, I was muted. Thank you, everyone, for your introductions. And I think we can certainly move into the Q&A portion of this. And I think what we're going to definitely try to do in light of the diversity on our panel and in attendance is hopefully have this conversation intersectionally, dehomogenize, demystify the displacement experience at the level of the Levant, and also dehomogenize and demystify the queer experience across the different contexts that we're trying to look at. Much of the work we do at the Institute, and I'm happy to answer questions on this later as well, is linked to internal displacement displacement and the queer experience, refuge and the queer experience, as well as the processes of asylum where possible and where permitted, and the queer experience in Lebanon as well, across different groups, predominantly Syrians, but also Palestinians from Syria and Palestinians from Lebanon too. So happy to throw that into the mix. And as we do try to have this conversation, once again, intersectionally, maybe an initial question for all of you, and perhaps Pinar, I'll go to you first, based on this recent report that was published and kind of that comparative lens that you employed to your study. How do international legal frameworks and humanitarian responses in the Levant fail to protect queer and trans individuals experiencing displacement as a baseline? But then how does that also translate into a bit of a hierarchy of vulnerabilities within the community, kind of making that distinction and also separating the very particularly vulnerable, at least that we found in our research, trans experience and displacement as well. Happy for you to kick us off, and then I can give it to the rest as well.
Sure. Well, Turkey fails to protect queer and trans refugees in many ways due to lack of legal protections, xenophobia and homophobia at the social and institutional level, and also very limited services tailored for the needs of queer asylum seekers. And based on the report, LGBTQ women specifically. Especially during the presidential and parliamentary elections, not to be so political, but in Turkey in 2023, the political discourse was full of anti-refugee and anti-LGBTIQ sentiments, which led to a rising xenophobia and homophobia and transphobia in the country. So these are heightened by the religious intolerance against, persons of diverse SOGS in the country, and increased political mobilization around the protection of sacred family values. And in 2025, so 2025 is declared as the year of the family in Turkey, so we'll see how that goes. So LGBTIQ refugees, LGBTQ women in particular, they face a continuum of violence in Turkey based on different intersecting, factors such as space, be it public, private, semi-private, and by different actors, be it state or non-state. Such as administrative officials, landlords, the host community, law enforcement, immigration officials, the refugee community, and the family members themselves. And also, although I use the term refugee, by the way, the term does not include non-European asylum seekers due to the geographical limitation we have on the Refugee Convention. So queer Syrians are under temporary protection, and Palestinians, Iranians, and Afghans, and other queer refugees from the Levant area are under international protection in Turkey. So their rights and their access to their health, work, social assistance, their mobility within the country, and many other needs basically are limited and restricted based on their legal status. One simple example about health may be international protection applicants and status holders lose their health insurance after 1 year. And this is one of the main issues LGBTQ women mentioned during our interviews. So due to this restriction, they face barriers accessing free health services. And unfortunately, the medical services in Turkey are very expensive. And this specifically affects trans refugee women who seek assistance in terms of their gender transition process. On the other hand, the resettlement process is very slow. It is very time consuming, and LGBTIQ refugees are basically left in a limbo for years. So I have no logical explanation for how a temporary protection can last more than 10 years, so to say. I don't have a proper answer to that. And with the recent changes in Syria, my colleagues back home told me that the resettlement for Syrians has stopped. So countries have been canceling flight tickets. The US, obviously, EU countries as well. Germany is not the best place to be, and unfortunately. And the reasoning is since we all know there is no more war, so you can go back home. But that is not a choice for Syrian refugees with diverse OGS, so to speak. Especially thinking how, for example, for trans women, the more you do not conform with the accepted, social norms, you are subjected to an increased level of violence and discrimination by your family members and the community in general. And in terms of humanitarian response, I would say there are very limited services tailored for the needs of LGBTIQ refugees. And UNFPA Turkey, for example, is one of the few organizations who provide services to these targeted groups. So like here, they have a project called Key Refugee Groups, which they have been implementing in the past few years. So that could be a good example. They have, Palestinian beneficiaries, Afghans, Syrians, Iranians, and there are a few local NGOs who they collaborate with. However, the thing is, it's very homogenized. The services are very homogenized, and they're not tailored specifically for the specific needs of LGBTQ refugees. And I would say that also, finally, in terms of LGBTQ women, there are no safe spaces or safe shelters dedicated for their needs. And although allegedly the women's shelters in Turkey are open to all women, LGBTQ refugee women face serious xenophobia, lesophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. Transphobia, if in any case they try to seek services in these shelters. So yeah, and I will continue with the services and what they lack in the previous rounds. So that's all from me for now.
No, wonderful, and thank you so much. I think it strikes a lot of parallels with the work that we're doing at the moment on this conversation on return, as the region is so tumultuous and politically evolving. At the moment, we're working on a couple of things. The first on not so much whether or not Syria is safe or a part of a certain country is safe or not, but rather who it's safe for and who is able to actually return and make that decision. A lot of the queer Palestinians from Syria, as well as Syrians in Lebanon, have answered us like, why would we care if there's a fall in the regime? This doesn't factor into my conversation around safety or return. So drawing from that as well as a parallel to what you found. And if I could move the conversation to Ribal a bit, as someone that is also representing, as you said, quite a few organizations, wearing multiple hats and largely representing organizations that, of course, work very much in Lebanon, but also extend to the region and the Levant, to what extent have your organizations that you represent and other organizations been able to network around the different crises in the region, whether we talk about the situation for Palestinians at the moment, the situation for people across Lebanon? We say there's a ceasefire in Lebanon, but what does that really mean? So I'd love to hear more about kind of networking and engagement and your interaction with different actors across the region, and how that, leading into our second question, of course, after I hand it over to Bshara, how that kind of feeds into this humanitarian conversation. Thank you. Thanks, Ribal.
Thanks a lot, Jasmine, for this question. So I would like to start a bit with a brief about the context in Lebanon and speaking of the crises, how this context has undergone multiple shifts in the context and how accommodating it was or is currently for LGBTIQ plus refugees or displaced people. So historically, Lebanon used to be considered as a safe haven for LGBTIQ plus refugees or displaced people in the region coming from different countries in the Swana region, Southwest Asia and North Africa. And that was even before the crisis in Syria and other like neighboring countries. People would come to Lebanon and seek temporary refuge on the basis of their SOGIESC, since UNHCR granted this option for displaced people or people seeking asylum or refugees on the basis of their SOGIESC. And thanks, Bren, for putting in the chat box the definition of the acronym of SOGIESC. So, however, Lebanon has undergone multiple crises in the past 5-6 years that definitely have disproportionate impacts on marginalized communities, notably the LGBTIQ plus community. We will talk more when we move into the following questions about the consequences of those humanitarian contexts. But it's important to note that, yes, organizations do exist to provide services to the community. There is a foundation for services for displaced people, for displaced LGBTIQ plus people. But it's also important to note that Lebanon, similarly to Turkey, is a country that does not protect or provide any sort of protection to LGBTIQ plus communities. On the contrary, it it criminalizes them to some extent. It embraces this systemic discrimination against them that put them in a situation where they're even further marginalized. National emergency plans often that are often tailored by international humanitarian organizations and agencies in partnership with the government pose a lot of limitations and obstacles to the inclusion of the LGBTIQ plus community, since the community cannot be explicitly mentioned in such documents, which makes the community further invisible. And when the community is invisible, it suffers from more marginalization and lack of access to services and so on. So amidst all this challenging context, LGBTIQ plus individuals do have their basic needs independently of the type of emergency crisis or the humanitarian crisis they go through. It's important to note that the Lebanese community, the Lebanese LGBTIQ plus community, is facing a lot of challenges, and this all obviously intersect with different parameters, different characteristics, different factors that the person can have, whether they're refugees, whether they're asylum seekers, they're stateless, they are people with disabilities, they're migrants, and so on and so. They're trans or cis, etc., etc. So and the system obviously fails to include and address all of these needs and all of those intersectional needs. So in that context, LGBTIQ plus organizations who usually are present to advocate for LGBTIQ plus rights and protection are forced to provide services to the LGBTIQ plus community to fill in the gaps. And Shara will talk more about the roles of LGBTIQ plus organizations when he speaks about Mosaic. But it's important to note that this has been like dragging for quite a while, although we've been talking about this issue for years and years about how the humanitarian system needs to be inclusive of the community, to which extent are we really abiding by the leave no one behind principle, to which extent are we really not leaving those individuals behind, we're considering their needs, their protection, their challenges within the core of our operations. Is it only related to trends, to availability of funds, where we can join a certain wave, or do we really care about the lives of LGBTIQ plus individuals and do provide tailored, specialized, adequate, and safe, dignified services to the LGBTIQ plus community? So this conversation can go on and on, but it's important to note that while the LGBTIQ plus specialized organizations do play a huge role in outreach to the LGBTIQ plus community, knowing their real needs, this sort of trust that they have, the humanitarian system has a responsibility to be more proactive in engaging these individuals and centering their needs and protection within their operation, and being more proactive in engaging with local CSOs to know how to do the job. These organizations have been there for quite a while. They know how to do it, but it's your role to do this sort of outreach or this sort of engagement, and not wait for local CSOs who have a lot of burden to reach out to you and ask for support. I'll stop here and maybe we can continue this conversation later when we move to other questions. Thanks, Jasmine. Over to you.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Ribad. And I think you raise very important questions on how the humanitarian space operates, right? What is considered a success in the humanitarian space? What does it really mean to access protection and services? And I think in much of our research, we try to unpack those nuances as well. Happy to share a little bit as well on a study we did on kind of how gender identity serves as a barrier to accessing services for displaced groups across Lebanon and the broader region as well. And on this point, if I can loop Bshara in, and as someone that has worked for ILGA in the capacity that you described, and also that works at Mosaic and serves as a board member, I'd love to hear your thoughts kind of around this conversation on prioritization in the Levant. And as we discuss conflict and as we unpack our realities, we are always talking about the conflict of the moment. But the problem is that the previous conflict is never resolved, right? We're dealing with intersectional overlapping conflicts. The conversation was around Gaza and the Palestinians for the longest time, rightfully so. When the conflict expanded in Lebanon and started to include the capital and other major cities outside of the south, the conversation focused to Lebanon. It's a very problematic space to be in where already people are falling through the cracks, but this gender dimension, of course, pushes people further into the cracks and into that kind of blind spots of the humanitarian space as well. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, on what Ribal raises around organizations serving as service providers, but also how do you prioritize as an organization that works regionally? How do you prioritize the crisis of the moment? And how do you kind of shift your focus across so many moving parts in the Levant as we are navigating multiple intersectional crises, but overlapping crises as well? Would love to hear your thoughts on that, Bshara. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Diab, and thank you again for having us here. So, as you mentioned, so many crises are happening in the region, and the issue is not about prioritization, but rather it's not like we pick which crisis we want to work on, but rather the crisis pick us. We have a helpline that operates 24/7, and then depending on what's happening, we just keep on getting the news, the emails, we follow up on everything. And the issue with these is that they are all interrelated. So one crisis affects the other. It all affects different populations in different ways. But unfortunately, the way it affects the LGBTIQ plus community as a vulnerable community in our region is exponentially different than the way it affects the host community, or like taking, for example, the recent war in Lebanon. We saw the impact on the LGBTIQ plus community versus the host community. And we saw the issue is not that it's the crisis that affects the community differently, but rather the services that aren't mainstreamed or do not reach the community members is what happens in a different exponential, I would say, spectrum. But since we're talking about regional, I guess, issues that have been happening, and having or had worked with ILGA Asia on Afghanistan, we worked with the Syrian community, also with the Iraqis, migrants, refugees, the Palestinians. We are witnessing like crimes, and not only the crisis itself, but the hate crimes that become that increase during these crises on a global scale. And even more so pronounced in our region when we're talking about the Levant or West Asia, because of the lack of protections that already didn't exist before these hate crimes or crises were happening. And then they go under the radar and they keep on happening worse and worse, more and more, just because they can go undocumented. There is no access to justice and all of these things. So, sorry. So, we've seen, for instance, when we're talking about Iraq, we saw how a new law was ratified that specifically targets the LGBTIQ plus community. A death penalty was being discussed. We saw in Jordan a serious crackdown on all LGBTIQ plus activists with the closures of the LGBTIQ plus organizations because the activists had to leave. We saw even during Qatar, for instance, when we had the World Cup and there was a highlight on the LGBTIQ plus community. And after the World Cup ended, we even saw how there was further crackdown on the community, on the activists that were talking, even more on conversion therapies that were happening that were even government funded. But moving to more recent events, we look at what's happening in Gaza, for instance. Of course, it affects everyone, but the LGBTIQ plus community has doubled the effect, whereas they are in a war. They are in a war with society. They are in a war with the enemy, and a lot of blackmailing. We've had incidences of, for instance, Israeli IDF blackmailing LGBTIQ plus individuals based on their own SOGI identity in order to reveal information, in order to have them work under their own, like basically to spy, and this really creates a lot of conflict between your internal culture, your internal identity, how you see yourself or where you want to go or how it's happening. Furthermore, we moved to Syria, where, as Pinar previously mentioned, like, yes, the Syrian regime fell. Everyone is saying Syria is safe, but is it really safe? Because after the Syrian regime, surprisingly, we've had an 80% increase of calls on our helpline asking us for support because they're either being threatened inside of Lebanon to be deported back to Syria by extremists or people who are blackmailing them or exploiting them because they know they will get hurt there or they will be persecuted. And we've had increase in cross-border migration or people seeking asylum or refugees coming back from Syria when everyone's claiming that it's safe, coming back to Lebanon and seeking refugee or asylum or help or any kind of support just to escape the fact that there is no more control on who kills who persecutes who. So it's a bit of a wild card there, specifically more for the LGBTIQ plus community. So how are we able to support or tackle them? How do we identify best practices? It's really hard to tell. It's been on a case-by-case scenario, learned experiences, what's happening, trying to collect ourselves under, let's say, the LGBT task force that Ribal co-chairs. I mean, of course, we need international support, but a lot of the international support also comes sometimes through international organizations, which have higher different priorities. They look at the larger scale, but fail to see what we see or fail to address the invisibilized communities, whether we're talking about migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, all the LGBTIQ plus community itself in specific, within all its intersectionalities, within all its different intersectionalities, of course. So it's really, it's been hard for us to understand the different contexts that are arising, but it's also, we've been able to respond quicker than we would have been able to respond had we been working individually as organizations. So some of the best practices I would say was first and foremost was establishing small safe shelters, which isn't a thing in our region. We've never had safe shelters for the LGBTIQ plus communities. They weren't accepted in regular shelters based on SOGI, based on appearance, sometimes just because they were getting harassed worse, so they would be better off on the streets. And then when they try to get their own shelters or to rent their own spaces collectively, they're exploited, they're blackmailed, they're physically abused. So it's been a series of different intersectional, I would say, or interrelated uh, human rights violations. But what we were able to do this time, like in the war, we were able to establish small shelters, which has been or proved to be a very successful pilot project. And we are hoping to move forward with it and try to find different ways where we can have shelters for individuals, not only to stay away from harm, but to also be able to provide them with different programs where they can increase livelihoods, where they can get psychosocial support, which is very lacking, and not only lacking, but not tailored to the LGBTIQ plus community. So there are a lot of services that we've been able to tailor through the experience that we've been doing for over like 14 years in the field. When it comes to the legal support that we provide, when it comes to the psychosocial support that we are giving, when it comes to the emergency cash assistance that we are providing, because even providing cash assistance is not something that might be mainstream for other target populations, but not for the LGBTIQ plus community. A trans woman cannot go to the bank because the donor said they need to be done through a bank. They cannot take their IDs because they might not have IDs or they might not represent their current expression. So there are different ways that we usually try to provide the services, and where we always and first and foremost follow a do no harm approach. And it's been proven to be really good. But again, with all the funding cuts, with all the different priorities, with all the lack of, I wouldn't say lack of international support, but a lack of LGBTIQ plus prioritization and funding. So they always come as a checklist or checkbox under a bigger fund and given to organizations that do not really target or support, mainly because they either don't know or they don't want to know. And this is where we try, for those that don't know, we try to build their capacity by doing SOGI awareness, case management for LGBTIQ plus. But for those that don't want, there's really not much you can do, because for instance, in Jordan, the reason why the backlash happened was because of an INGO that had national staff that were homophobic or transphobic or queerphobic or LGBTIQ plus phobic, and they released this information to the government, which led to the backlash against the community. So there are a lot of different contexts that we need to be navigating through, not only the crisis itself, the government, the extremist movements in society, and all of these are things that we try to navigate and work And I will stop here so that maybe we can move to another question, and we can always add and free to help to answer any questions anytime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bshara. I think you touch on a few very important things that will take us into this next question around delving a little bit more into the humanitarian response. Not just what success looks like there, but also what are kind of the practices that are isolated from this conversation, similar to this conversation on shelters, but also what are other types of services that are simply just not as effective and should be counterintuitive, but they're not, similar to cash programs and absolutely everything in between, as you pertinently highlight too. In much of our research, particularly with queer refugees in Lebanon, particularly Palestinians, they tell me that their networking and their groups are largely most successful in the informal spaces. Their engagement with NGOs and organizations outside their places of residence is quite low. However, they do thrive in these informal spaces, these WhatsApp support groups, these informal networks, Facebook groups. We've heard some of the most innovative conversations from Palestinian refugees, part of the community, on how they navigate the space and how they do this also across borders as well, how they're connected with other Palestinian people who identify as part of the LGBT community in Jordan and even inside Palestinian territories as well. Drawing on this conversation around, again, the humanitarian response, I'd love to hear more from all of you. And Pinar, perhaps I can bring this conversation back to you, not just around how international legal frameworks and humanitarian responses in the region in many cases fail to protect queer and trans individuals, but kind of what are some of the innovative coping mechanisms attached to this, whether at a regional level, transnationally, or otherwise. Anything you'd like to throw at us there would be great. Pinar? Yes.
I think I had a connection problem. So sorry, Jasmine. Can you just repeat the question again? So sorry.
Wow, repeating the question, Hick, in a flow, it's going to be a totally different
Yes,
question.
I'm so
But
sorry. I'm so sorry.
no, it's okay. So we were discussing moving to this conversation on humanitarian responses and building a little bit on what we found around kind of informality and informal spaces. I'd love to hear from you, not just how international legal frameworks and humanitarian responses in the Levant in many cases fail to protect queer and trans individuals experiencing displacement, but also in your findings and in your research, what are some innovative coping mechanisms that you found? So for us, it's been all of these informal spaces, these WhatsApp groups, these Facebook groups that operate not just inside Lebanon, but across the entire Levant, particularly among Palestinians that we've spoken to. So just a little bit, maybe perhaps in your findings on the humanitarian response and coping mechanisms, if there are any as well.
Sure. As I mentioned, and thanks for repeating that, by the way. That was amazing. So in Turkey, as I mentioned, there are a few service units, service providers, actually, like local NGOs who collaborate with UNFPA Turkey through the Key Refugee Groups project, which provide services to LGBTQI refugees. The thing is, due to the lack of resources, due to the lack of funding, the service units, the services are scarce in terms of numbers and also capacity. However, I would say that in terms of the importance of these, since you said safe spaces, the importance of the service units is crucial for the LGBTQI refugees, especially considering how they are constantly subjected to violence and discrimination in the daily aspect of their lives through community members outside in the streets. The service units are basically their safe spaces for them to be themselves, to be as non-conforming, in quotation marks, as much as they want to be, and basically be themselves physically and especially visibly. So, for example, due to the lack of funding, due to, let's say, and Bashara talked about this, like relying on international organizations. Well, as we all know, like relying to international funding is basically one of the hugest problems. For example, US aid stopped aid basically. And due to that,
I know from the folks back in Turkey that they already have a few service units around the whole country, and we're talking about 6 or 7 service units, and we are talking about 81 cities in Turkey. And they had to basically, right after the stop of that aid, they had to close 2 or 3 of their service units due to the lack of funding and due to the lack of resources. And when I spoke to a few beneficiaries who benefited from those service units before, they basically told me that, you know, they have nowhere else to go. They have no safe spaces to go. They can only meet with each other at homes. However, they need those safe spaces for solidarity, to see that they are not alone, and to basically build this community, if I may, and, you know, like, basically feel like they are not left behind. So yeah, that's what I would like to say about this. And if anything else comes up through Ruban and Bashar, I'd like to add later on. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And yes, I will actually, Ribal, turn it over to you to input to the same question. If you'd like to add insights a little bit more across all the organizations that you work with, kind of around, I think we keep circling back to this conversation on safety and also how subjective this conversation around safety is. If there's anything you'd like to add there, please go ahead.
Yes, so I would like to build upon what Pinar mentioned, and the last talking point that I mentioned in my first intervention about the collaboration with LGBTIQ plus specialized organizations. Definitely, there's a huge role in terms of mainstreaming and prioritizing the LGBTIQ plus like communities in different humanitarian contexts, especially with displaced people. The humanitarian coordination and architecture has a mandate to do that. There exist different principles that we could refer to, whether the Yogyakarta principles, whether the interagency standing committee, and all of these different principles that do mention explicitly the rights and the importance of or the obligation to protect and include LGBTIQ plus individuals in humanitarian responses. But unfortunately, this is not always the case. And as we mentioned earlier, when we were talking about intersectionality, when we also talked, speaking of the Levant, since we're focusing this conversation on the greater Levant, for instance, we know that the main UN agency leading portfolio or the mandate on displacement, on refugees, asylum seekers, returnees, and so on is UNHCR. But when we talk about Palestinian refugees, it's not UNHCR, it's UNRWA, for example. And we all have witnessed what UNRWA was subjected to in the past year or a year and a half, with all the budget cuts and all the backlash that UNRWA has been facing, which also imposed some threats and risks to the Palestinians in general, Palestinian refugees, and definitely Palestinian queers. In addition to that, we need to take into consideration, and this is why I started the conversation earlier about the systems, the context in Lebanon and the Levant, and how challenging it is for the community, where discrimination is quite embedded in the norms and the system, and is quite embraced by the political system, by the state, the governments, and so on. And these organizations do have their limitations because they cooperate with the government when they propose emergency response plans and so on. So I would like to take the opportunity here to talk about the last war that happened in Lebanon, and the escalation actually of the war, because the war sort of started on October 8th, 2023, but the escalation and the full-scale war was exacerbated towards end of September 2024. And there was a national emergency response plan co-designed by the humanitarian architecture and the humanitarian coordination and the government, and it unfortunately failed to include LGBTIQ plus individuals as usual. This was not surprising, but unfortunately it had major like repercussions on the community. So we know that LGBTIQ plus organizations do have their limitations. They face a lot of gaps, whether funding, whether other resources. So in the face of such a major crisis, there's too little to be done, or like the resources are too little to use to respond to the rising needs of the community. Displaced people, yes, they are displaced regardless of their SOGS, but in displacement, there are also some risks that are very particular, and intersectionality is also a thing to be considered in such a context. Yes, there were collective shelters that have been established, but to which extent they were safe for LGBTIQ plus community members, especially people with diverse gender expressions and gender identities, or cis normative identities, to which extent these collective shelters were safe for them. And we've noticed that it hasn't been the case, and LGBTIQ plus individuals, at least who explicitly present their diverse OGS, didn't feel safe seeking shelters in those centers. And one of the things that Shara mentioned earlier is the major, like the significant need for shelter, whether for individual shelters or at the cluster level, at the sector of the shelter, where too little is being done for the LGBTIQ plus community. Speaking of that, the LGBTIQ plus community's needs and challenges has often been restricted to the gender-based violence sector or the protection cluster, whereas the needs of the community go beyond gender-based violence and protection or gender-based discrimination. They do have their livelihoods needs. They do have their education needs, their wash, shelter, health. The SRHR is quite important. It needs to be maintained, but LGBTIQ plus individuals not only suffer from sexual and reproductive health and rights needs, they do have other needs. They need to be included in national health systems. They need to feel safe accessing primary health care, and so on and so forth. So the list goes on. And back to that crisis, we have witnessed that all of these needs have been exacerbated, particularly when it comes to shelters. Shara talked about that success story or best practice in terms of establishing small, safe shelters that have proved to be effective, but at the same time, they require a lot of funding, and the resources are too little. And these needs would continue even beyond this very imminent crisis. So we do know that there has been a ceasefire, but the ceasefire has been too fragile. What do we know about the queers that are in southern Lebanon, where the villages are still occupied? We don't necessarily have tangible data about them. So yes, there's a lot to be discussed about this. But I just wanted to point out that the major needs that we were able to identify, because we did sort of an assessment within the task force, with the members of the task force that include specialized LGBTIQ plus organizations and international humanitarian organizations, we have noticed that the main needs were related to food security, to shelter, livelihoods, and health. And it's important to continue the mainstreaming and the collaboration with all these different sectors to ensure that diverse OGS and people and LGBTIQ plus communities are properly included and prioritized across all of these sectors. Over to you, Jasmine.
Wonderful. And perhaps I will, also being wary of time, I will hand it over to Bshara and then back to Pinar for a small response. Thank you so much, Ribal, for touching on this conversation on resources and funding, as our region currently is reeling from an executive order that impacts not only humanitarian funding in the loosest sense, but so many people's lives and their lived experiences, whether you work in the humanitarian space or are a participant in any of the services or any of the protections that the humanitarian space affords you. And with that, I think I will hand it over to Bshara for your final intervention, Bshara, before we turn it to Bren a bit and then for the Q&A. how does this conversation on resources and access to funding in the humanitarian space impact your work at the moment, particularly in two of the most recent crises the Levant is really reeling from? Two of them are very much still ongoing, whether we talk about the plight of Palestinians or the plight of Lebanese, particularly, as Ribal said, people from the South at the moment. We've published one study on queer IDPs from the South, but our findings are largely qualitative, and access to the community and doing something large scale once again requires funding and requires the support. So would love to hear your thoughts on that before I turn it back to Pinar for a final comment. Shara, please go ahead.
Thank you, Doctor. So I really want to reiterate what Ribal just mentioned, because I think it's a very important point, and it goes back to why the LGBTIQ plus or the LGBT task force was established in Lebanon, because initially activists, organizations were too scared to be talking about these issues in the general protection or the general gender-based violence work groups. So it was because of that, because of other organizations that work on protection or work on gender-based violence, that were leaking information or causing issues or backlash within the government and other stakeholders. And similarly speaking, livelihood, shelter, wash, food security, all these other sectors, there is little to no mention on LGBTIQ plus needs. And this is something that's really important to flag, because this is where all the organizations usually work on. So thank you for raising this point, because it's really important and I had forgotten about it. Speaking of the anti-gender movement that's happening globally, it's really impacting us on a unfortunately on a large scale. For instance, because of what's happening in okay, so there are two sides to the story. Back when we were working as LGBTIQ plus activists, it used to be a Western propaganda or agenda that the Lebanon or our region doesn't want to, support. But now that the West decided to move with, or the general voice is an anti-gender movement, you see them, oh, look, this is happening in the West, we should adopt it. This is correct because it's coming from the West. So there's a lot of discrepancies when it comes to the narratives that we wish to adopt. And this is where our role comes in really changing the context and the narratives, that this is not a Western agenda, it's a human rights based, this cannot be happening. But it makes it harder when the West, or when Trump is moving the opposite direction. Fundings have been frozen, cut. We're talking about a 3-year sustainable funding that, for instance, Mosaic was supposed to be working on, that's now frozen. We're talking about another BPRM fund that we're supposed to be part of, frozen. So we're talking about a huge pillar that has been taken. And even if it resumes, we are not sure that the DEI or gender diversity, equality, inclusion are going to be part of these coming fundings. So now it's a really gray area for us as to where are we going to go. And if this movement catches up, as we saw in some comments with the Dutch government, with other European governments, it's really going to be difficult to move beyond or continue providing the services or even advocating for what we need to do. So not only does this affect us on a financial level, but it also affects us, as we mentioned, on an advocacy level, but also internally and locally. This is providing a platform for anti-gender movement advocates that didn't have a platform before to stand up and talk. Now they are talking. Now we see conferences being organized in Lebanon, sponsored. It's really, really well managed. It's really well planned. There is it's funded, it's being supported. I don't know exactly where and how, but we see billboards being posted across certain regions in Lebanon. We see conferences being held, and this is something that never really happened, or to little or no extent in Lebanon. So we see that whatever happens globally does have a ripple effect on us here. But what can we do? Of course, I'm not gonna. It's one answer is clear. It's funding, funding, funding. We need to really find alternative ways to fund ourselves, to find the supportive funding for whether it's targeted for LGBTIQ plus refugees, whether it's a general fund, but that has mainstreaming in it, that has some kind of priorities. But again, I don't know how this will be still feasible or possible. Another thing would be closed door lobbying. So one thing we do is like we try to have closed door lobbying with embassies, with UN agencies. And when we say closed door, it's like we're not posting it on a general agenda for safety reasons, but this usually helps. Like, for instance, if the government, the US, let's say government used to fund, let's say governmental institutions, they can put some kind of form of conditional support, like, for instance, don't ratify the LGBTIQ plus criminalization law, which is a draft law now in Lebanon. So there are always alternative ways, but again, we don't know now with the new movement how possible this is with certain governments and how much is going to catch up. Another thing is representation. It's always important for us to have a certain form of representation in international events, to have like, thank you, for instance, Bren and the Gender Society for providing this platform where we are able to put out our issues, our concerns. It brings also a lot of networking. It could be behind closed doors. It could be resource sharing. It could also be expertise, capacity building, understanding how to move forward with the support of the international community that still cares. And in a way, it keeps the conversation alive. A lot of times, like especially when the Iraqi law was ratified, one thing that we got from the queer community there, they said, we've been talking about this for 2 years. 2 years, telling them do some action, put something in international community, stakeholders, UN agencies, and this is where we got to. 2 years talking, not being heard, and eventually we ended up with a law that can get us to the, I don't know, to the death penalty or worse. So it's important to keep the conversation alive, to keep this networking, these spaces open, and to find ways where we can lobby and support each other at the end of the day. And thank you again for hosting us here, and I'll end it with that note. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bshara. And again, because I'm very conscious of our time and the time that we have left, Pinar, just because so much was said, would you like to have any final comments or anything you'd like to add before I turn it over to Bren?
Sure, just a quick note. When Riban mentioned mainstreaming, I remembered one point that I'd like to make. So there's very little understanding of the intersections of the categories of women, men, and persons of diverse OGS. Protection mechanisms who target the needs of refugee women are tailored for the needs of cis heterosexual refugee women, as if queer women are a different species. So they fail to take into account how not conforming to dominant heterosexist and cisgender norms and expectations greatly increases diverse OGS women's risks of encountering violence on top of the broader discrimination and violence they face in a patriarchal society. Just a quick example. Service providers in Turkey had problems accessing Syrian lesbian women, for example. Although not clear, it seems like this was linked to the fact that most Syrian women came to Turkey with their families, unlike, for example, Iranian lesbians and bisexual women, let's say, and most of them are forced into marriage or closeted, and therefore they are unable to escape the grip of their families, including for fear of violence, if their SOGS is revealed. And compared to trans Syrian women, Syrian lesbian women mostly do not have the ties with the queer community, so they do not have access to the information or the existing services. So if mainstream service providers took into account women with diverse sexual orientations, this might be a way to enable Syrian lesbians and bisexuals to access their needs, even if they don't have the expertise. Through proper referral mechanisms to the local NGOs who provide services to these communities, this could be solved. So I just wanted to make that small note because I think it's really crucial.
It is. Thank you so much. And I think that's a wonderful note to end on as well. There is so much more for us to unpack that certainly this hour and a half is not going to permit us to, especially as we speak about a region, as we said, that is implicated in so much. But so many of these nuances and what we call in our research, these hierarchies of vulnerability are also very under-discussed and certainly not factored into protection programming, as you said, for lesbian women that fall into the trope of either being underfunded in a women's program or underfunded in a queer-focused program. There's so much to unpack there. And with that, because we have about a little under half an hour left with each other, I'm going to hand it over to Bren, who's going to moderate a small section of this Q&A, and then we will open it up to your questions as well. In the meantime, I'll review our document where you've all thrown all your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Bren, please go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Jasmine. Thank you all so much. And okay, I think I'm gonna change things a little bit. Since we have a fairly big crowd, not sure if maybe we'll just take questions in the chat and then we can keep recording so the panelists can keep names out of it when they answer, and then we'll actually be able to have the full responses. So before we do that, folks can think about, again, if you want to change your names, to turn your cameras off, etc. I will ask if the four of you can share a call to action. A lot of folks' knowledge is helpful and we want to do something. So would love to hear from each of you what the participants can take away to help issues, fundraising, be in solidarity, etc.
Wonderful. Ribal, would you like to get us started, perhaps? Since you spoke the furthest to go.
So call to action.
Yes.
So I want to build upon what I mentioned earlier, and I would stress on the importance of prioritizing the LGBTIQ plus community within the humanitarian coordination. And I would primarily recommend international actors, including international humanitarian organizations, donors, and UN agencies, to ensure the safe and adequate multi-sectoral inclusion of LGBTIQ plus community in humanitarian context, particularly within this displacement settings and displacement context, and particularly when the concerned state fails to include these individuals and these communities, and rather contributes to their remarginalization and and vulnerabilization. This is my main recommendation or call to action when it comes to including the LGBTQ plus community within the humanitarian sector. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
I think if I were to build on what Ribal says, much of what we encourage, at least in the academic space, and of course we are all attached to the advocacy and humanitarian space, but the academic space is where our institute, of course, operates the most, is this real call for participatory research. We walk into our studies and our researches and even our humanitarian programming and the design, and as a consultant and as an academic, I can tell you this, we walk in with our preconceived notions around what the priorities should be and what the agenda should be. The most fruitful and impactful research that we've done has been through this participatory lens and this moving away from tokenizing people and involving them in conversations because you need to check a list. Really involving members of the community in the design of their own programming, the design of their own research, and the prioritization too. So perhaps just as much of a call to action as a call for a shift in the way we do things, even on our end, in the privileged spaces where we get to have these conversations as well. Thank you. Thanks. Shara, if you'd like to go next, or Pinar, before we hand it over to everybody.
Sure. So very quickly, maybe. So basically, I would say advocate for policies inclusive of refugees of diverse OGS without homogenizing their experiences, and advocate for resettlement to third countries, especially that we just mentioned Syria, and promote the integration and inclusion of LGBTQ refugee women in GBV programs, especially livelihood programs, ensuring their needs are addressed within mainstream frameworks. And obviously for international donors to ensure long-term funding to these programs and to make these programs more sustainable rather than constantly being under threat of shutting down.
Thank you very much. And Shara, would you like to close off our call to action section?
Thank you. Yeah, I would reiterate everything that my co-panelists just mentioned, specifically, especially on the note of the sustainable funding. It's always a struggle to keep having to worry about it every 6 months, every year. Core funding is something that's really essential to keep the organization moving and the services being provided. And also, going back to your point of participatory approach, I think as simple as it may be, sometimes small collaborations could have bigger impacts and lead to bigger sustainable effects. Like a small example would be like the recent collaboration that we just did today, opening up the space to talk, or even on the call for inputs for the displacement for people with different SOGIs. So all of these, even though small, or whether we do a publication together, knowledge outputs, anything that really highlights and keeps the conversation flowing on the need is really appreciated and can have a bigger impact than we really think, even if it's sometimes small. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Bshara. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone as well. Bren, would you like to close us off, or shall we jump into the Q&A? How would you like to do this?
Yeah, I think we can jump into Q&A, and then at the end, before we hit our 90 minutes, we can share a feedback survey. I understand if folks need to go before then, but in terms of the questions, I was noticing, of course, funding is like such a big conversation right now with all of the chaos happening in the world. So there were quite a few funding questions, but folks have been addressing some of those as the conversations have gone on. And then there's another group of questions here, Jasmine, I see you're in the document, that are more towards the humanitarian side, faith-based organizational support. So yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on what you think. We have maybe 15 minutes left.
We do. So what I'm going to do is I've also organized in a separate sheet. I've grouped some questions together, and I will give them to each of you to answer as you connect to the questions. Multiple questions do address this conversation on funding. Questions revolve around what are the main issues that funders are not addressing, what is needed from funders to better support humanitarian responses, and of course, a little bit more specific questions on the US aid funding cuts and how this impacts the conversation. I believe we've covered this, but please touch upon it if it contributes to the conversation as well. And beyond that, on the role of the diaspora in funding support to LGBT CSOs and services. We see this very much in our research with Palestinians and Syrians, as well as Lebanese, this role of the diaspora. Would love for you, each of you, if you connect to the questions, to touch upon kind of this cluster of questions around funding and donors and aid. So please, by all means, unmute yourselves as you deem fit.
I mean, I can go first. So as we mentioned, the US funding cuts have really severely affected our work. Not completely, because we also had other sources, but to a major extent, we were really relying on a lot of different funding opportunities and already secured fundings from the US government that are now frozen. Generally speaking, I don't know how this will also affect our relationship with the US Embassy in Lebanon, which we're somewhat a supporter to the work that we do under LGBTIQ+. So I also don't know how this translates. It's not just about funding, but I don't know how this translates to more than that. They were never really part of the task force. They were actually, and I think Ribal can talk about it. But with the recent shifts, we haven't been seeing them active within the task force much. And when it comes to diaspora, they do play an important role, and I think this role also comes when there's an important role when it comes to networking and also providing opportunities or connections. But also, for instance, during the recent escalation, because when it first hit, we weren't able to directly reallocate funds. So one of the first things that we did was the crowdfunding campaign. And banks in Lebanon and people in Lebanon that are affected did not really have much of an ability to be really doing the donations. It was all fully based on the diaspora population. And they were the ones that really funded the first emergency response that Mosaic launched through the crowdfunding campaign that they supported us.
Of course, crisis after crisis, that you do not want to also fatigue the diaspora. So even fundraisers aren't much of a sustainable solution, but they do provide us with a little support to lean on, I would say, for some extent. It's always good to engage for the diaspora to be aware of the work that's happening on the ground, to be in touch with the local organizations if they are interested in the work that is being done. So I really think this all plays a role. As for the bigger donors, I think we always said they need to increase the fund. Like from what I know, based from the Equal Rights Coalition, it was out of the whole global funding, 3% was going to the LGBTIQ plus supported funds. And out of this three, it was around 0.3 to 5% that was targeting our region and like the MENA region, not even the Levant region. 0.3 to 5% of this global funding was coming to the most affected region when it comes to LGBTIQ plus. So I think it's really important to try to get the voices out, the messages out, that try to understand why this is happening and to maybe do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bshara. Ribal or Pinar, who would like to go first? If you have anything to add on that question in particular.
I mean, since I don't work in the field right now specifically, I feel like what Bashara and Ribal would say is much more important, and not being careful with time, not to say the same things, but basically the main issues, again, to echo this again, funders are not addressing is funding the integration of LGBT refugee women and LGBTQI refugees in the broader support program. So mainstreaming, I would say. So just to echo that and then leave it to Ribal.
Wonderful. Ribal, please go ahead. We'll try to squeeze in a couple more questions, but please answer this to the fullest and then we'll move on.
Right. So I don't have much to say. I think Bshara covered much of it. The situation has already been too dire, and the funding that the community or the organizations working or supporting the community has already been too little, and now it's even more challenged. Organizations and movements need to unfortunately be seeking alternative ways of funding. Mentioning the diaspora is something to be considered. However, these mechanisms are not properly established. There has been, in a way or another, there has been a quite of a dependency on these sources of funding, unfortunately, and this has also manifested in a way where people would also depend on organizations providing services. So in a way, this entire architecture and the way these mechanisms have been designed and set created or reinforced this dependency, and it's the greatest time now for us to reassess, reconsider the way we've been operating, how the movements have been operating in the face of all of these challenges. So whether collaborating or coordinating with the diaspora, adopting different mechanisms that are more sustainable, income generating activities for organizations and communities that would have like a good impact. I would like in this occasion to mention this has been already shared in one of the texts above about queer mutual aid, in addition to the support that we urge you to provide to Mosaic. There's also, since we've mentioned community-based and community-led responses, there's also the queer mutual aid that we can also support, that supports queer and trans individuals on a monthly basis for their shelter, for their rent and other expenses, including their basic expenses. There are different ways to engage with queer mutual aid, whether through visiting their Patreon page or directly transferring money to their bank account. So, and this has proved to be very efficient. The queers know how to do it. They know how to act quickly. They know how to organize quickly, regardless how big the crisis is, and we've seen this firsthand during the past few months and the past few years. On another note, just something else, since I brought up earlier the report that we have developed within the task force. This is not a public report, but if folks here would like to have access to that report, I'll leave my email address so people could reach out, and we can definitely exchange this knowledge that we had created safely. Thanks, and over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ribal, and thank you to all of you for engaging with the question. While I am, of course, weary that we have just a few more minutes left, perhaps what we could do is give a few closing remarks, each of you. Many of the questions in another grouping, another cluster of focus is around when and why landscapes changed for queer asylum seeking, when they change in different contexts and in crises of the moment. When do we focus on these issues, and when do we kind of dismiss them as part of a narrative that's just inconvenient in the moment or not as urgent in the moment? This makes me think actually of a paper Bshara and I put together on crackdowns that took place in Lebanon sporadically, whether on refugees for 1 minute and the queer community for another, and how people that fell at that intersection were navigating vulnerability across that regard. Perhaps any thoughts on this that you would like to add, particularly on this issue of the crisis of the moment, as we speak about Palestinians and their plight and much of the pain that they've endured across the last year, but for generations, as well as the plight and the pain that Palestinians continue to endure in Lebanon, as well as other people across the Levant. What are kind of some final messages on this? Anything you'd like to add to kind of wrap us up and bring this home before I hand it over to Bren? And we thank everybody, as I'm recognizing that people are dropping off and some of us have to leave. So any additional thoughts or anything you'd like to input to this, please. Perhaps, Pinar, we can start with you if you'd like. Anything you'd like to add, and then Ribal and Bshara before we wrap up. If you could unmute yourself, Pinar, I'm sorry. Yeah,
No
thank you.
worries, no worries. Sorry for that. So very quickly, maybe, just to, on that point of the crisis of the moment, to me, what it makes me think of is that LGBTQ people are subject to two continuums of violence, pre or post conflict, pre or post crises, so all the time, basically. So it's not basically like it's not suddenly happening with crises, it's just increasing with conflicts and displacement, basically, but it's always there, be it family violence, be it violence from community, from the institution. So that's always there. The homophobia, transphobia, biphobia is always there, but the intersection with crises basically increases what's going on. So yeah, maybe to be aware of that, maybe to be aware of the continuums of violence and how that needs to be addressed in general, in terms of humanitarian protection and services. And it's not a one-time thing, basically, what's happening. And maybe a quick example from Turkey, I would say, when you said that, being stuck in the intersection of crises, like during, as I said at the beginning, during the general elections in Turkey, the political discourse was divided. Basically, the far right was basically scapegoating LGBTQI people. The left was scapegoating basically the refugees, and the intersection of that was, surprise, surprise, LGBTQI refugees, basically, and they were affected the most, basically by that moment. So yeah, so just be mindful of that, basically.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Bshara, any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I mean, after everything we said, I would
No, you
just
look
reiterate.
exhausted, but go for it. Go for it.
No, it's just about keeping people in mind when it comes to anything, whether it's programming, whether it's advocacy, whether it's research, whether it's any kind of intersectional work that we want to do, to really keep the holders of rights in mind that we are doing this work for them, and we want to adopt the most do no harm approach, because sometimes we really tend to forget that, and it puts people in worse situations than ever. And to also remember that because this is something that was also spoken about, but like pink washing, to always be mindful of it and aware of the pink washing, especially when it comes to wars, to genocides, to human rights. It's also important to understand that this is something that does exist and that we need to be also mindful, aware of it. And I guess with that, I would just leave it there, and to always be aware, just be mindful and aware in all the work that we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bshara. Ribal, any final thoughts?
Yeah, quickly. There was a question that you raised earlier about UNHCR, or when were LGBTIQ plus individuals granted this sort of
Absolutely.
ability to seek refuge on the basis of their sex. So GS, I believe
Yes.
in 2008, UNHCR began recognizing the need for refugee protection on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expressions and sex characteristics. And obviously, this was also the case in Lebanon, and that was before the crisis in Syria, for example, which began around 2011. There's that. On another note, and just to end, solidarity, explicit solidarity with the LGBTIQ plus community and the LGBTIQ plus movement. I know this comes with a lot of risks, with a lot of threats. We know this firsthand, trust me. But at the same time, the LGBTIQ plus movement is always at the forefront of any other battle, of any other struggle, of any other cause, of any other fight for rights, for freedoms, for protection. And the community also deserves this sort of solidarity and this sort of support from other allies, because it's a big fight, and this sort of backlash and crackdown that we have hinted to throughout this conversation is affecting everyone, obviously, but unfortunately, it affects the LGBTQ plus community disproportionately, especially if they're displaced migrants, refugees, and so on. So this sort of explicit solidarity and support is pretty much needed more than ever for us to be able to continue this kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ribal. I see Pinar's hand up. Pinar, you have 1 minute.
Okay, quickly. So basically, I just wanted to finish on a positive note, because we talk about
There we go.
violence, we talk
Okay.
about, there you go. We talk about violence, we talk about vulnerabilities because we have to. It's the narrative that is shaped by the system, by the humanitarian organizations. But basically, there's always the other side of the coin and the other side of the story, where basically LGBTQI refugees have agency, solidarity, resilience, love, care. So it's important to basically see the whole picture and have a more holistic approach to the queer stories and experiences, and not only vulnerabilize them, basically, because that's not the reality at all.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for ending on that note. I think before I hand it over to Bren, I'd just like to thank you all for this space, and Bren and the society for really hosting us and letting us just go with it for the last hour and a half. Beyond that, at the Institute, we love these types of collaborations and having these types of conversations in public fora. So if you are interested in having a conversation with us, and I'm sure Bren will reiterate the same, find us and reach out to us, and we're always ready to have these talks. Bren, over to you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, all of you. And Jasmine, you are a kick-ass moderator. And yeah, just underscoring everything, please reach out to us or any of the panelists. We'll share a lot of this information and the report that we mentioned that we'll share out within the next few days. Plus, SGP will be at CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, talking about these anti-gender movements, which came up in the chat. So keep an eye out for that as well. It is, yeah, that's a big conversation that we've been having for a little while. And then I think lastly, just I guess we don't really need to share screen, but we have a feedback survey. Would absolutely love to hear from you all about what you thought of this. Are there a different or additional recommendations you have for follow-up conversations, adjacent conversations? We do want to use our platform, oh thanks Lou, as much as we can. And then you can also hang out with us, get involved in SGP, become a member, talk about a Gender Cafe. And yeah, we are a big volunteer only network and definitely welcome more folks there. And then the last slide is, yeah, our contact info. We'll share out the contact info of the panelists and Mosaic and IMS and all of the acronyms that we have mentioned in the past 90 minutes. So thank you all so much. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out, info@genderprofessionals.org, or again, we will share out a follow-up and welcome continued conversations. So thank you all. This is an extremely important conversation, and Pinar, thank you for ending us on a bit of a positive note. It is very appreciated and necessary in these times. Thank you all so much.